Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us back to the short tracks with Richmond Raceway. Unfortunately, the trucks don't run here, but we'll be talking about both the Xfinity cars as well as the Monster Energy Cup cars, talking a little bit about setups and a little bit about lap times as well as some different options with driving the racetrack. This track has multiple grooves and multiple ways of driving the track. So we're going to get into all of that. So let's get started. Before we get into the discussion of the setup itself, let's start off by talking a little bit about the track as well as lap times. My lap times in the Xfinity car are somewhere around a 21 flat, 21.1. Either way, those are going to be perfectly fine against the AI there. Cup cars are somewhere in the 20.4, 20.5 range for race laps. And the way I drive this track is, even during practice when I'm not around any other cars, is I like to drive the track the same way I would during the race when I'm having to pass a lot of cars. So in close proximity. So the setup that we're going to be looking at, first and foremost, had to be stable, and it had to rotate well without over-rotating when I'm in heavy traffic. So I had to be able to use the brakes and really be aggressive with the car without having to worry about keeping the car under me during all of that maneuvering that you're going to need to do to get around the AI car. Particularly whenever you get to lapping cars, you're going to need a lot of stability. So that's what we're going to be seeing. Now you notice we're in the Cup car on your screen, but I run almost the exact same setup for the Xfinity cars. We'll talk about a few differences when we get to the end, but basically I run the exact same setup between Xfinity and the Cup. With the shocks, as we get started on the setup itself, shocks, I'm running the 3-5 combination, bump and rebound. That's one of many combinations that you could run here. I like a softer spring here since I am heavy on the brakes, and it makes the car feel really good for me and very comfortable under braking. If you want quicker transitions, quicker weight transfers, then increasing those shock values will certainly give that to you as well. And of course, you can always adjust each individual corner on its own. Weight settings, we want maximum left side weight because it is an oval. And the front weight is at 50%, wedge is at 54%. Those two numbers really work together in combination with the springs and in particular the track bar to get the right amount of rotation and the right timing of the rotation into and through the corner so that you don't get too tight or too loose. So if you're feeling like the car isn't quite rotating enough on entry, then one of the options you have is to decrease that front weight. Get that down below 50% and the car will start to turn better, particularly on corner entry. With the wedge, the higher the wedge number you use, the more stable the car will be, the tighter that the car will be. The 54% is a great number here for me because it keeps the car very stable and I can drive it very aggressively without having to worry about getting too loose. But if you find out that the car isn't rotating overall as much as you need it to, then lowering that wedge number will certainly help with that. Moving on to the spring settings, I love to use very stiff springs at this particular track because even though it is a short track, you spend so much time on throttle here and really on max throttle here. Very little time off the throttle. So I wanted the car to rotate when I wanted it to rotate, but also to be very stiff so that I didn't have to worry too much about weight transfer. That's where the stiffer springs really come into their own. Maximum 1,200 pounds on both the right front and left front springs, and that really helps with the grip up front and, as I mentioned, a very sturdy foundation for the car. The rear of the car, very much the same. 600 pounds in the right rear, which is the maximum spring you can have in the rear. 500 pounds on the left rear, giving me 100 pounds of rear spring split. That allows the car to rotate, particularly from the center of the corner off when you're under throttle. It allows the car to rotate without over-rotating and getting too loose. If you find that the car is too loose on exit, then one of the options you have is to, in this case, increase the left rear spring and decrease that overall spring split in the rear of the car. If you find out that the rear of the car is driving the car too much, you don't like quite that much rear end movement in the car, then you can lower both the left rear and right rear springs together. For example, you might lower them 50 pounds each and go with 450 on the left rear and 550 on the right rear, and that will make the car tighter overall, as the rear of the car will be doing a little bit less work. On the tire side of things, anywhere from 25 to 27 pounds should be pretty good on the left sides, 30 to about 32, 33 pounds on the right side, just depending on how you want to adjust the feel of the car, as well as the temperatures of the tires themselves. The right rear, particularly during a race when you don't have a whole lot of setup options that you can change, if you're too loose on exit of the corner, dropping that right rear can help out. If you're too loose on the entrance to the corner, then increasing the right front can really help out with that. So you got some options there if you just want to use the tire settings and not go into making a bunch of spring changes and wedge and so on. Moving on to the miscellaneous settings, the camber, both the left front and right front, is maxed out at 10 degrees. I didn't start off with it like that. In fact, I thought I was going to have to reduce it some just for the heavy braking, and it turned out not to be the case. The more camber I put in it, the faster it went, and I didn't suffer any issues with stability under heavy braking, which sometimes can be the case when using a lot of camber. So if you find that the car is unstable under heavy braking and gets snappy loose on you, then one of the things you can do is simply drop the amount of camber that you're using. Front sway bars at 1.15 inches, which is pretty standard for me on these cars. It gives me the right amount of firmness to the front suspension so that the car is stable while not going so high on it that it actually starts to take away front end grip from the car. The left and right side track bars, both at 9 inches, and I find that the flat track bar works for me at most places, and particularly here, I didn't need a very high track bar. 9 inches worked well because I decided to help the car turn more by using stiffer rear springs. So one of the options that you have if you don't quite like the feel that you're getting here is to drop those rear springs, maybe 100 pounds each, and then that will allow you to raise the track bar here on one or both sides, and that can help the car to rotate, but it gives a little bit different feel in doing so. Moving on to the brake bias, 70% turned out to be the sweet spot for me. I've used as low as 60%, but what I found there is the 60% really helps the car to rotate under heavy braking, particularly in turn one, where you can really come in from a wide arc in there, but using 60% could get a little bit squirrely under heavy braking, and the car could get a little bit too loose. So 70% turned out to be really good. You can go a little higher than that, around 75, 77%, but then the car starts to get really tight under heavy braking. And that's generally the way the brake bias will work. The more front brake you put in it, the higher number you use for the brake bias, the tighter the car will be under heavy braking. So that makes for a very quick adjustment that you can make to the car. Grill tape, basically all I cared about here was to make sure the car didn't overheat. Otherwise, it seems to do nothing in the game as far as drag or downforce, unfortunately. The wheel lock, normally I use about 10 degrees on the asphalt tracks for the trucks, Xfinity or Cup. This time I used a little bit higher at 15 degrees because I wanted a little bit quicker steering. Again, it goes back to the way this track drives. It is so fast and you spend so little time off the gas that I wanted a little bit quicker steering so that I didn't have to steer quite as much and quite as drastically into and off the corners. Steering offset is 0.10, and that is simply to offset some of the hard pull to the left on the straightaways that you're going to experience from all of the camber that we're running in the front of the car. Gear settings, pretty standard here until you get down to the rear end ratio. I'm using 422, and that gets me up, I want to say somewhere around 8,800 RPMs. So there's plenty of room to worry with that being maybe a little bit higher or lower than what you really want to run. I know some people like to really wind out the engine and get up over 9,000 going into the corner. Some people like to back off of that a good bit. Just keep in mind that as you adjust the rear end ratio and increase or decrease the RPMs that you're running, that will adjust the handling of the car. The fewer RPMs you're running, the tighter the car will generally be on throttle because you're not putting down quite as much power. The opposite is also true. The more RPMs you're running, the car will tend to be a little bit looser on throttle as you're trying to put down more power or get more torque out of the engine. Now, as far as differences between the Xfinity and the Cup car, really there are only two. The gear setting would be one. I'm running I believe a 444 gear in the Xfinity car just to turn a few more RPMs because you don't quite have the horsepower there, but a little bit more RPM for a little bit more gear to get more RPM out of the Xfinity car. And then the grill tape is 5% more at 45%. But otherwise, they are identical. Now, there is a lot of speed to be had at this track. Again, if you really use a wide arc into the corners, you can get even faster for sure than the speeds that I gave you, being around 20.4, 20.5 for the Cup and around 21 flat or so for the Xfinity cars. There's more speed there, but again, I like to practice and set up the car the way I'm going to race it in traffic. And then if I am not in traffic during the race, then I always have the option of adjusting my line, but the setup is always geared for the traffic. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully some of this can be useful to you in making your own setup for Richmond. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more as we continue our NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming.